Alrighty, hello and welcome to Discord Q&A number 12. Just going to do a little bit of a sort of wind up before we get into the actual questions themselves for this one, because this is something that's I've been thinking about and did want to mention because I think it's relevant for some of the ways that people talk about these videos and think about these things. I'm not an expert on every single thing that I talk about in these questions. And in a lot of cases, I answer these questions without doing a lot of what I would consider to be like due diligence. If I wanted to answer these questions to the maximum of my ability and at the highest quality, I don't sit down and do 30 minutes of research for every question. And some questions, actually, I'd probably need to do more than that, right? Some less, of course, right? But the reality is the way that I've structured these Discord Q&As, the way that I treat them is I try to get people answers. And there are some questions in my Discord that I just skip over and I don't answer at all because I feel like I can't even give them a low quality answer that would be at all, satisfying or at all accurate. But just keep in mind that there are lots of things, I'm sure I haven't gone back and watched through all of these videos. I'm not going to do that, but I'm sure that there are some things that if I did more research, I'd give a slightly different answer, or in some cases, maybe even a meaningfully different answer. And there are some things I'll answer because I'm familiar with the topic, but I'm not necessarily the biggest expert. And also, at the end of the day, the answers I'm giving are just my opinions. They're not necessarily like the word, the law, right? They're not necessarily the absolute truth, right? I'm giving you my perspective, like my thoughts off the top. I have valued in these Q&As getting through a lot of questions and giving a lot of different perspectives over super high quality, super accurate answers only on topics that I am an actual expert in, or like I am, one of the foremost experts in, because I feel like that's a better use of my time, right? Like the reality is if I actually only wanted to answer questions that I'm a, top of the line expert on and I did a lot of research on, I would maybe have made like one or two of these videos at this point, given the time that I've put into them. And I think that the value proposition for giving you answers that are 80% the quality or whatever, in most cases, or or higher, maybe in a few cases a little bit lower than that, but a lot more content is probably more valuable for people than me doing 30 minutes of research before every question. So I just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of people have overread into some of my answers here. Just keep in mind the things I'm saying here are just off the top, up front. I did try doing a little bit higher quality. Actually, if you look at video number 11, I actually went back and cut out some of my answers and replaced them later because I felt like they were too low quality for me. But again, this is really just me trying to do a balancing act of getting these videos out so people can have their questions answered, even if it's not necessarily the best possible answer that you could ever get. So just wanted to mention that. Let's get into this video though, and actually get into these questions, starting out with ADC role quest satisfaction, talking about not getting to 6 full items, and the big visible part of your role quest is getting an extra slot, but you're not but some players may not be satisfied by not getting to use that slot every game. There's a couple of things I'll mention here immediately. Number one is that slot can be pretty powerful even if you never put a full item in there, right? As a, just random example off the top of my head, imagine you have 2 complete items in your inventory, right? You have Yuntal and Quick Blades or something like that, because you're playing Sivir, and you have boots, and you have a Doran's Blade, and you're going to build an Infinity Edge third because that makes a lot of sense. Suppose that you base with enough gold to buy all the components, but you can't buy the Infinity Edge. In a world with the 80 carry quest, you can buy that extra crit cloak. Or depending on your basing order, maybe it's a pickaxe that you're getting, and you can have that in your inventory. And so you might show up to a fight with an extra 25 AD or 15% crit that you wouldn't be able to do before. And that's this is a realistic scenario. This happens in a lot of games, right? Where that small amount of extra damage, right, 25 AD there is probably actually about 25%, or sorry, not 25%, about 10% more damage at that point for Sivir, roughly. And the crit cloak is, I don't know how much percent auto attack damage it is, but it's something, right? It's some extra damage, right? And so there are situations you can run into where the 80 carry quest is relevant, even if you're not finishing a bunch of items. And also the intent of the, instant gold reward that the 80 carry quest, or sorry, the bot lane, carry quest gives was that not only would it make the quest more tunable and get you, that plus the, increased CS reward gets you a bit of way towards getting your full build going, but also that instant gold spike would be really rewarding for some of those players that aren't that are AD carry players or bot lane carry players that aren't playing for, the 6-item Jinx dream fantasy of, hey, well, there are Draven and Kalista players that just want to spike fast and snowball the game and end early. And that was what the goal of the goal of that initial burst of gold that you get on completing the quest was saying, hey, if you finish your quest really early, there's a really powerful reward for that you get to keep snowballing with. On top of the fact that also gave us something we could tune. It was a number, right? Whereas the slot is not really tunable, right? We either give you the slot or we don't. There's really nothing about that we can tune other than the time at which we give it to you, except or giving it to you super early doesn't really matter, right? So ultimately, the answer here is if people aren't satisfied with that combination of rewards, we might want to reconsider some of the exact outputs that we have on the AD carry quest, or when we're giving it to you, or any of these things, right? As an example, we could do something like, hey, actually, you start with 1 extra gold per minion on the AD carry quest no matter what, and then it goes up to 2 or up to 3 or whatever after you finish the quest, and that's something that people are some people might be excited by if they really like farming, right? There's other things we could do, and ultimately, hey, I've talked about this a number of times. The role quests seem like they're doing really well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to keep them forever. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to keep them exactly the same way forever. Maybe the slot isn't the right thing for AD carries. Maybe it should be something else. I don't know. But this is just me mentioning like, hey, number one, you could think about it in a different way, right? The slot is good, even if you don't always hit full build, right? You're not going to hit full build, like actual 6 full items that often. Of course, we know that, right? But the instant gold reward is quite powerful, and hopefully that lends you some extra power when you are snowballing your lane, if you're like a Draven or a Kalista player that's just trying to win lane really hard and snowball the game out of control, right? And if that's not good enough, maybe we should change it, right? Maybe there's something else we could do. Maybe there's another reward. Maybe it shouldn't be an extra slot. Maybe it should be your item is upgraded or something like that, right? That's a version of it we tried as well, where it's just, actually, most of the power in the AD carry quest was upgrading an item instantly to get more stats on it, right? That's always an option, right? Something we considered pretty heavily, but decided to go with the slot instead. But there's other stuff out there as well. And yeah, ultimately, if the role quest isn't satisfying people, then we can change it. I will say I don't have offhand all of the data, right? There is a bunch of survey data and stuff and sentiment data that we have internally about the role quest. But since I'm not one of the people working on the role quest stuff, I haven't really looked at it, and so I actually don't know off the top of my head, like, hey, how's the AD carry role quest satisfaction doing right now? I actually don't know. But the reality is, if people aren't happy with it, maybe we should change the rewards, and that's definitely on the table. All right. Should Axiom be reshaped into a generic ult haste item? This is interesting because one of the proposals I've had before, and I've talked about this on my stream, but I don't think I've ever talked about it in the Discord Q&As before, is one of the proposals I've had before for stats in the system as a whole is I've suggested splitting haste into basic haste and ultimate haste. And I still think to this day, this could be a really, we should probably test it. We've never tested it. It's just been a theory that I've proposed, or like a proposal that I've made several times, where certain classes buy haste, classes buy haste for different reasons, right? Fighters, for example, a lot of fighters actually mostly care about the basic ability haste, right? Because they're trying to be really repeatable. They're trying to make it so that they only, they build enough durability to get to their second rotation of spells in a lot of cases, right? Like Jax, as an example, wants to be durable enough to get 2 counter strikes in a fight. That's the perfect amount of durability for Jax. Because if he can get 2 counter strikes, he can kill almost anyone, right? And you can actually team fight as well with that, right? Renekton would love to be durable enough to get a second W off, to get a second, rotation of his spells off, right? Like his W and E particularly, right? And so on and so forth, right? And so basic ability haste and durability sort of multiply on fighters. But the ultimate haste for them is something that they kind of get for free in the haste system currently, but it's not necessarily something that most of them value. Some of them do, right? Like Riven, for example, does really like ultimate haste, but for a lot of them, the basic haste is the thing that they're looking for, right? Conversely, you look at AD assassins, for example, and sure, some of them like Zed do care a lot about haste on their basic abilities, but for a lot of AD assassins, the reason why you want haste is mostly because you want to reduce your ultimate cooldown because you're gated around your ultimate to kill people, like Rengar, for example. Not to say basic ability haste is bad on Rengar, it's not, but if you're building assassin Rengar, the main reason why haste is good on you is because it reduces your ult cooldown so that you can kill people more frequently because you're mainly gated by having your ult to actually kill anyone, right? And so on and so forth, right? So different classes, we would want to have different levels of access to different types of haste. And there are some upsides and downsides to haste doing both, right? As an example, mages would probably need access to both. There's lots of mages that want haste on their basic abilities. There's lots of mages that want haste on their ultimates. And there's mages that want haste on both, right? They just generally like all forms of haste. But the reason why I'm referring to this whole proposal here and why I think it's interesting and why it's relevant is because from my perspective, I think it's interesting that people are asking for Axiom to be reshaped in a generic ult haste item, because I think as a class, AD assassins actually have the most benefit from that as a stat, but we don't have an item for them. Now, I think then the question wraps around to like, should Axiom Arc be that item? And I think it's actually pretty compelling to me that AD assassins, or assassins specifically, have this item that says, go out there and kill people, and that's how you get your ultimate haste. I think one thing about it that's a little bit weird that I don't love is that it's specifically rewarding for you randomly splashed damage on someone and your team killed them in like a skirmish or a team fight or whatever, right? As an example here, let's suppose you're Zed, you pick someone off, you catch someone in rotation, you kill their support or whatever while they're warding, or you ult their, I don't know, their mid laner or something like that when they're like rotating, after catching a wave or something, you pick them off, you get one kill. If you had Axiom Arc, not that anyone's building it on Zed, right? But I'm just using this as an illustrative example here. But if you did get that, that's one kill's worth of value, and the Talon that goes into a big team fight and hits two people with his R and hits another person with his W, and your team cleans them all up, the Talon actually gets more value from that. And that part of that is by design because it's supposed to be good in team fights. But I do think it's a little bit awkward how it's shaped, where dealing random splash damage for people that your allies can kill is actually quite powerful, and that's worth a lot. That's actually a really, really high value thing that you can do to make Axiom better. But I don't necessarily think that we should change that. It's okay. I just think it's a little bit awkward. But in general, I would say that I'm not super compelled by saying that Axiom should be like another ult haste item, just like the others. I think that it's cool that it's unique. And in general, as I often say, about many things in League, but especially the item system, it is compelling for there to be differences between different subsystems. The fact that Assassins, their like ult haste item works differently from the other classes, I think is interesting, right? As long as it's not, incredibly confusing or unlearnable, which it's pretty clearly not in either, for either of those in this case. I think it's good for Axiom to be different. Now, if we wanted to make another ult haste item for AD Assassins, I would be totally on board with that. Now, maybe a little awkward that it coexists with Axiom or whatever, right? Maybe that's weird. Maybe it's fine. I don't know. I've never tried it. But I do think it does make sense to be asking questions around, hey, shouldn't AD Assassins, who are the class that most wants to scale their ult cooldown with gold amongst all of our classes, shouldn't they have access to this stat that other classes have? Yeah, probably. And they sort of do with Axiom Arc. And I think it's fine that Axiom Arc is different. But this kind of makes me consider, like, actually, should we be making a ult haste item for AD Assassins that isn't Axiom Arc, that isn't based on kills, and instead does something cool and interesting with your ultimate or whatever, right? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It's an interesting thought. I'd be very interested to make a prototype on it and see how that plays out in the AD Assassin system. But it's not something where I'm sitting here and saying, oh yeah, we should definitely turn Axiom Arc into that item. I could see a world where maybe we have another sort of pay it forward takedown trigger, and maybe that means we want to remove the Axiom Arc, like, hey, I'm going to be powerful in the future because I killed someone kind of style here. And maybe in that world it should be an ult haste item. But in the current structure, I think it works totally fine. So I'm not super convinced that it should be changed. All right. Moving on to why is Endless Hunger the first satisfying total AD payoff item, and why mostly base AD scaling on items. So one thing I'll address here is that items are not mostly base AD scaling. They're actually more commonly bonus AD scaling, right? The Sheen family and Sterak scale with base AD. The Sheen family, I think, is this is just my guess, because Sheen has been base AD forever. I can tell you why we kept it that way, but I suspect the reason why they did it originally back in the olden days when League was being designed, I suspect the reason why Sheen was made base AD was that they wanted melee champions to have better access to the power of Sheen. But back then they didn't have range melee splits on items. And so they did a base AD ratio, which was something that they could do, which essentially sort of melee skewed it. And simultaneously, you start with a lot of your base AD at level 1. Depending on how much base AD you have and what your AD growth is, you roughly double your base AD over game time. But you start with half of that value at level 1, right? And so instead of going from like 10 to 180 at like at 10 at level 1 to 180 at level 18, the formula essentially starts at like in this equivalent example, it would be like starting at 90 and going to 180 at level 18. So you start at a really high floor, even if you get Sheen super early on in the game. So it essentially has a compelling base damage if you build it early. And this is very rewarding if you build these items early. So it makes them first slot. And they're not, they're not hard scaling items, but they do scale a little bit over game time so that they're not useless at level 18, right? So I think a lot of the base AD scaling, particularly on Sheen, really makes a lot of sense structurally. I mean, it makes sense because we've made it make sense, right? Part of the reason why it stayed that way is because we like that structure and we've preserved it over the years. The reason why Sterak's has base AD scaling is because it was, as I've mentioned, I think in literally the number 11 Q&A, Sterak's was originally intended to be the Juggernaut defensive item, and Death Stance was supposed to be the defensive fighter item for the medium and light fighters. Now, obviously, that didn't work out, right? The medium fighters and even some of the light fighters ended up on Sterak's anyway, but the base AD scaling was there because it was totally fine to make it more powerful on Juggernauts than it was on the other champions, and it still functioned for the Juggernauts, and it wasn't a problem that it would have base AD scaling, generally speaking, right? By the way, I don't know if I don't think I ever mentioned this, but the reason why I keep talking about like Juggernauts and like lower target access stuff is that the champions who have lower target access, specifically Juggernauts, tend to have much higher AD per level, right? We have Juggernauts with like 5 AD per level, for example, right? Whereas like a normal AD carry might have like 2.3 AD per level, and a regular fighter might have like 3 or 3.3 or something like that. And obviously there's variance, right? There are some champions that are well outside the bounds that I just mentioned, but that's kind of the typical, and so the item system interacts with the typical, and if we think that that isn't working for some specific champion, we can always change them. Now, that's why we have a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot. We have some base AD scaling on items, but let's talk about the actual question here, which is Endless Hunger, the first satisfying total AD payoff item. I think there's a number of reasons here. I think a lot of people internally have been skeptical about powerful AD scaling, like AD like scaling items, or I don't know what the right terminology would be. Like, I guess AD payoff item. Sure, that's a good, fine enough term. Fine enough way to speak about it. Because we have a pretty diverse bunch of subclasses that stack AD, which is AD carries get a lot of it, and some of our AD carries get an enormous amount of it, right? Like Samira, for example, and Ezreal. But Ezreal's a caster, right? He's not really a traditional AD carry, right? He's a caster, right? So we have some small subset of AD carries that build a lot of AD, right? This is Draven and Samira and MF. We have AD casters, which is like Ezreal, Smolder, Jace, right? And then we have assassins that also stack a bunch of AD. And then we also have some light fighters that stack a bunch of AD, right? This is Riven, Hecarim, etc., right? So this is one of the spaces where like capturing an audience here is, and like making sure that you don't have unintended users that are doing things to your item that you might not like necessarily want, is very difficult when you have a lot of champions sharing the same space. In fact, actually, one of the things that was heavily that was proposed by some people when I was working on this item was, hey, maybe you actually need to give AD assassins more lethality and less AD on their items if you want to make this item, because they could potentially buy this item and get a ton of haste and maybe do some things that we don't want them doing. That didn't really play out in tests, and so I didn't believe that was necessary. But ultimately, that was a risk that a lot of people were really internally were really concerned about when I started working on this. And generally, I was concerned about it a little bit too when I first started working on it. But when I tested this thing, the conclusion pretty quickly was like, actually, this is not a problem. I think particularly when I added tenacity to it, that helped a lot, because tenacity is just something that the champions we want to get the most benefit from this item, which are champions like Hecarim, Riven, Aatrox, etc., like Red Kayn, value a lot. But champions like Ezreal and Samira don't value as much. And so while Endless Hunger can still be good for them, they're not getting the maximum value out of the tenacity, and so that helps a lot. And I can always range melee mod. It's something I've considered and might still do in the future if needed. But I essentially just gave myself a bunch of useful levers in order to be able to tune it between the different users. But that's why a lot of these items haven't been made in the past, even though they've been proposed. And I think there's even been other people who prototyped items in this space, is that there's a lot of users in the big AD builder space. And it's difficult to sufficiently differentiate them via stat binding because they kind of all like a lot of the same stuff. They all like vamp, they all like haste, they all like AD, they like damage, right? They're all doing a lot of similar things. The differentiators are like, yeah, the AD assassins like lethality more. They want to scale their spell damage specifically, and like, oh, the AD casters, they often auto attack in their range, right? In the melees, they need defenses and they need things like tenacity, etc. Right? So I was able to find, I think, some good differentiators. But I think a lot of this just comes down also to most people don't want to make capstone / payoff items because it's very hard to get people to build them as well. Look at Overlord's Bloodmail, like how much of a struggle it was to get people to start buying that item, even when it was pretty powerful. We had to really shift it into being good second slot for a few champions, and it's still not that popular. It's really not that popular relative to how powerful it is. And I think Endless Hunger is actually similar, but Endless Hunger is high fantasy enough and has some really high synergy users like Ezreal and Hecarim, such that people picked up on it. And I hope it'll get more popular over the course of the next few months as people catch on, because it is pretty strong right now. But it's hard to get people to catch on to these payoff / capstone items because they're late in your build, and so people often don't think about them very much. Like people tend to think mostly about their first couple of items. And so items that haven't been in the game for 10 years that are new payoff items are just very hard to get people onto. That's something that we've pretty strongly found, basically since the mythic item system, right? Like as an example, we added Stoneplate, right? And Stoneplate was very unpopular. That version of Stoneplate was a capstone item, right? And it was a very unpopular one. And some of that's probably because it was inactive and other things related to it. But some of that was just, yeah, you don't get to build this item every game as a tank, as a capstone, and it's not always good. And also it's just not something you're thinking about that often, and so on and so forth, right? And so all of these reasons sort of combine to why this is the first total AD payoff item, or well, I guess it's bonus AD payoff item really, but that's why. I'm not saying those are necessarily good reasons. I'm just telling you the reasons why no one has made this before, and that's the summary of it. So, are Smite for jungle and wards for support the correct unique outputs for their roles? This is an interesting one because I think the answer is both yes and no for both of these. So let's talk about Smite for jungle first, right? From a pure sense-making perspective, right? Like I think I can give you like a one or two sentence answer to like why it makes sense for jungle to have Smite. The jungler is the person that kills, spends most of their game killing monsters. Therefore, they should be the person that kills the big, strong, epic monsters that help end the game. You know what? I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Just from a like read the words out, like sound out that sentence. You know what? That makes a lot of sense. From a structural perspective, though, there are definitely some flaws here. And if you look at the sort of social aspect of it, it's like, yeah, the jungler is under the most social pressure in games, right? They are the one that has, like, they are the role that has the most expectations set upon them by the other roles. The top laner is hoping their jungler comes and dives. The mid laner really wants their jungler to cover them while they're pushing out a wave. The bot lane wants them to come 3v3 when they get ganked by the other enemy jungler, et cetera, right? The most expectations, particularly in the early game, are on the jungler. And so from a structural perspective, also having the highest expectations in a very highly visible way in terms of, yeah, you missed this smite, or you stole this, dragon or whatever, throughout the later parts of the game, that doesn't necessarily line up with what we would want if we were designing like the perfect League of Legends without considering like any sort of basic sense making, like the jungler kills monsters kind of thing. I would guess that like if we wanted the Smite gameplay, which I think generally is good, like around Smite securing and stuff, we'd probably give it to like the support or the mid laner. Actually, sort of brief tangent here, we actually did have a version of Wild Rift that we tested many years ago, back when I was working on Wild Rift, where we had Smite on the support, which was a really, really interesting version of the game for securing only, not for like killing camps. But that, we didn't actually do it. It was just a test. But that was really interesting because it sort of moved some of the social aspect, or like the social tension, in ways that I think were positive. But anyway, ultimately, I think, the jungler is the one that kills the epic monster, or kills the regular monsters. They should probably be the one to secure the kills in the epic monsters. That kind of just makes sense, right? Wards for support is another interesting one where it's like, yeah, it makes sense that the support, who is the least personally powerful person on the map, would have the most favorable interactions with the most powerful system vision that doesn't have anything to do with direct combat, right? Like, yeah, you don't need to be strong to place a ward or to clear a ward. There's no reason why someone who is 5,000 gold up on you would be better at clearing a ward than you. I mean, I guess maybe they might have more attack speed, but that's not, that's a relatively minor point. And so from a basic sense making perspective, I think it makes sense that supports have privileged access to the vision system. Again, though, from a structural perspective, I would say that like assassins actually could be like a class with privileged access to the vision system. That's why Umbral Blade exists, for example, was people trying to make that true. That's why the second drawer in Domination looks like that. Is in reality that supports having this privileged access to vision creates expectations of them in the game, and it makes a role that's already not going to be as popular as the other roles because you're the weakest person on the map from a personal perspective. Oh, by the way, we also are going to make you interact a lot with this system that not a lot of people actually really want to deeply interact with, right? Most people like I think tangentially interacting with it, like, oh, I place a ward here to make myself safe from ganks. That's a pretty satisfying loop for most players, right? Or sweeping a ward so they can't see us do Baron, etc. Right? That kind of thing. I think it's good, right? And vision is generally, I think, a good system for League. But the downside of all of this is that like being the vision purveyor or the prime vision player on the game, like on the map, kind of double narrows the support, the interested support pool. People who are really who actually wouldn't mind being the least powerful person on the map now also have to like interacting with the vision system in order to be a great support player or to really feel like they're there for support, or to feel a high affinity for the support role. And so it kind of narrows down the pool of potential people who want to play a lot of support, which I think is maybe not ideal. But I don't think we can undo this at this point, right? As an example, it's like, because the people that really like the vision system, at this point, if you're playing League of Legends, you really like the vision system, you're probably playing support. And so we would if we decided to change that, we would be disenfranchising the players that have been playing support for potentially 15, 16 years, right? Because support was the vision role and that's what it's always been. And, we don't want to disenfranchise them from having, control over support, or control over the vision game. Now, I do think that, we could reasonably do something again, like trinkets, where it's like, hey, actually vision is more of a shared team system and the support is privileged at accessing it, but maybe they're a little bit less privileged than they were previously. It's like we could do another one of those where the support is still the best vision user, but they're a little bit less advantaged. That's not a crazy thought to me, but ultimately, my answer to this question is both yes and no in both cases. So hopefully that's a satisfying answer. Okay. When doing 20 to 25% crit, how did you decide which items kept and lost crit? BT, LDR, Mortal as examples. So let me explain this, and keep in mind that when this system change was done, this was done in the before the AD carry role quest was made, and so what was done here made a lot of sense, I think, in the context of the 5 item cap out, right, where you would have boots in your inventory, and some of the things here have degraded over the years as we've introduced other items and changed other items, and some things have worked and some things have not worked, right? I think particularly the things that have degraded the structure are the new version of Yuntal and Stormrazor returning to the game, and simultaneously the AD carry role quest has degraded this a little bit, and the fact that Shiv ended up in a position where it's not actually an attractive purchase for AD carries, right? So the intended structure for the 25% crit system was, okay, so your full build is going to have 4 crit items. We expect people to want to build 100% crit to get big damage. Okay, so given that, we want the 100% crit build to have all the big damage items, right? This is Infinity Edge specifically, and this is percent penetration, right? Because we want that to be a part of the 100% crit build, because we want at 4 items, AD carries to be saying, I am doing the most possible damage. This is my big damage build on 4 items. I get 100% crit, I get percent pen, I get Infinity Edge. I'm fragging. Like I'm absolutely destroying people, right? And ideally, of course, that was also desired that they would build a Zeal item, right? And so the structure was like first item, Zeal item, Infinity Edge, percent pen, right? And so that was the idea, was that would be the full damage build, right? And the deviation from that would make sense in some cases, right? The idea originally was, okay, if you build a first item non-crit item that can offer you a superior spike. This was originally intended to be Kraken Slayer and Shiv, and maybe Blade of the Ruined King, but that will delay you're getting the 100% crit and full damage setup, right? Again, this is degraded because Shiv didn't really work out. We changed Shiv. It's still not really an AD carry item. It's bought by like Akshan and Quinn, right? Then, if you didn't buy a non-crit first item and you went for one of the crit first items like an Essence Reaver or a Collector or whatever at the time, the idea was, okay, well then later on in your build, you get to choose at some point, you get to buy into some utility. This was things like Bloodthirster and things like GA. Those are the main two, right? And one of the problems I pointed out with the structure when we were working on it was like, hey, look, I don't think you have enough utility items because people are not going to go back into, I didn't think they were going to go back into buying Merc Scimitar, which that's true. It hasn't really played out that people are buying Merc Scimitar ever. And Maw is not good on ranged champions. And so you're kind of lacking some options here for AD carries. And I think that's kind of manifesting now as it feels awkward for AD carries in their full builds for some champions that you don't really have anything that you're super excited about building because you kind of run out of non-crit items that you're excited about. So I think this structure is definitely something that we should reconsider in the bot carry like 6 slot system, where I suspect we need more compelling utility options for AD carries. And we probably, I actually think we could probably potentially bring back that really attractive first item setup where it's like, oh, the first items that are at their actually help you spike really hard on one item are non-crit items. But of course, it's hard to get people away from the Yuntals and the Storm Raiders that let them have their first item spike and also scale crit, right? And that's why those items have to have BF Sword for what it's worth, is that there has to be some trade-off there. Anyway, but yeah, that's why this was set up this way, was that the goal was to have that either trade off on your first item spike or trade off for utility later on. And that's why these items were set up this way. But like I said, this is something we could definitely reconsider in the future. Like the system, I think it still kind of works, but it doesn't necessarily work as well as we might like it to, because obviously in a world where you have 2 non-crit slots, even if you're going 100% crit, we're lacking a few items there, I think, potentially for a few item options. And so this is something that's kind of a consequence of us changing the AD carry quest for relatively late in the game to the slot, as opposed to the things that we were iterating through before. We didn't have time to consider any changes to the AD carry, like the crit item system, because of that. And same thing with on hit, by the way, right? Like on hit champions just run out of items to buy. So yeah, that's definitely something I think we could consider in the future. All right. So why can't an item give permanent attack range? The short answer is that it could. It's just I don't think we would ever make that item. I don't think that it's actually realistic we would, for a number of different reasons. One being that attack range is an incredibly finicky and dangerous stat to modify. I mean, look at Yunara, right? She's 575 range, and that is a huge part, I think, of what makes her pro skewed right now, is that she's 575 range, which gives her a lot of agency in trades against champions that are lower range than her. And then she has a very powerful, somewhat reliable slow that helps her interact with champions that are higher range than her, right? Very similar to Varus, right? Who is also an extremely pro skewed 575 range champion. We'll talk about that in a couple of questions. I'm definitely going to get to that in this video, but yeah, we'll talk about that specific aspect of it later. But yeah, range is finicky and dangerous. And there are certain AD carry kits that I get very nervous when people suggest like making items that have like permanent range, right? Like Xayah, I think, is a really good example here, where Xayah is allowed to have a bunch of tools that AD carries aren't really supposed to have. She has hard CC that is actually quite powerful, especially if people are moving into her. And she has an untargetability, right? She has a lot of tools, part of which are limited by the fact that she has a relatively lower range, right? That's part of what makes her a reasonable champion design structure, is that she has limitations, right? Personally, I'm not a huge fan of Xayah's design structure, to be honest, right? I think that she has too many things. Like, I particularly dislike the MS on her W that actually makes her okay at chasing people. I wish she was worse at chasing people, but that's neither here nor there. I'll move on from the Xayah point. But yeah, there are a number of AD carry kit structures that I think would be very dangerous to give extra range to, where we might end up needing to meaningfully modify kits and like actually round down strengths of those kits, because with extra attack range, some of the things that they do are potentially not acceptable anymore. But also another thing here is just that attack range is the kind of thing that is going to be extremely powerful and potentially satisfying in the hands of very skilled players, but will not be satisfying or powerful for lower skill players. And I think it's actually okay for us to have items that are different power level for different skill levels. That's actually totally fine. But the caveat to that is that I think they actually need to be understandable and satisfying for lower skill players. Look at Actualizer, for example, right? It's like, if you're a bronze Rise player, you can understand that if you activate your Actualizer and then you get stunned immediately afterwards and the fight, ends, that was a bad usage of Actualizer. Or you are a gold Morgana player and you are Zonias and everyone, it gets out of your R while you're in Zonias. That probably wasn't that good of a Zonias, right? Or any combination of these things, right? Like item actives are a classic example of high MMR skewed item effects, right? And we're okay with that, given the situation of like, okay, well, as a lower skill player, you can learn and understand what you did wrong, and you can still feel the power of this thing. My main concern with a permanent attack range item is that we could probably only give you 25 attack range. Maybe we could push it and give you 50, but it's kind of horrifying to think how bad the stats on the item would have to be to give you 50 permanent attack range. That would be like kind of outrageous, I think. So both from a power budgeting and from a satisfaction for all players standpoint, I just don't think that a permanent attack range would make sense on an item. It's just so much power even, right? Like I think the power budgeting thing is also like worth thinking about here of like 50 attack range is a crazy amount of power. And I think it's really difficult for me to imagine how we structure an item like that to be satisfying for anyone who is like under diamond, really, right? Like even at diamond, honestly, I think your kiting skills probably, your range leasing skills are probably not high enough to be able to maximize that item in a way that's satisfying for you, right? And so I'm pretty skeptical of items that, the idea at all of items giving permanent attack range for all these reasons that I've listed. I'm not even sure which one, thinking about it right now, I'm not even sure which one is the most concerning. Probably the kit warping stuff, right? Like champions like Xayah, I just don't think can be allowed to have more attack range permanently. It's okay if they have it temporarily, right? That's why like Hex Optics and Rapid Fire Cannon can exist. That's totally fine. But permanent is very, very, very scary from a number of different perspectives, which I've gone over here. All right. Was Rell reworked to enable jungle, or was it a happy accident? The answer is neither. Rell was reworked to make her support play more satisfying, and the designer who was working on that project, there were several different designers that worked on it, I believe, but the main one that spent most of the time working on it believed that people would really want to play Rell jungle, or that this was a really interesting off role for her, and so he added these extremely heavy-handed jungle mods in order to enable that. And I will tell you straight up, like there were a lot of people internally that were very skeptical of this, that said like, you probably shouldn't do this. This is too extreme. Even if it works, it's probably not worth it, right? It's going to do some things to Rell support that are probably not desirable, et cetera, right? As an example of a place, the thing that I think people were thinking of in this situation at the time that was worth noting was when we did Blitzcrank Jungle. The reason why Blitzcrank Jungle was removed was not because Blitzcrank Jungle was a problem, right? It was because the jungle stuff that had been done to Blitzcrank was actually affecting Blitzcrank support and was making Blitzcrank support less tunable. And we had to take things away that were, we had to take power away from things that were fun for Blitzcrank support in order to make Blitzcrank jungle function, because we had to give Blitzcrank support other power, like, the attack speed and on hit on his W, for example, in order to make him a functional jungler at all. And Rell was very similar, where we were limited in what we could do for her support. We had to take away things that were fun for her support because of her jungle. And the reality was that basically no one played Rell jungle. Now, I know there are Rell jungle players out there, but keep in mind that the pick rate was like essentially a rounding error, right? Like if you told me that that was a statistical anomaly in the data and that was an accident on any given patch, it would be very believable. That's how low the pick rate numbers were on Rell jungle when it was actually factually pretty powerful. And so because it was an extremely pro-skewed role that basically no one was playing in solo queue, it was easier for us to tune support. And I think the right thing to do to make support as correctly tunable as possible, to remove Rell jungle eventually and just make her, return her to just being a support. And so, yeah, the answer to that question was neither. That was a sort of bonus on the mid scope that was being done for Rell. All right. So, what parts of Varus are skewed towards pro play / non-bot lane? A couple of things here. One thing, like I was talking about earlier, I think is his attack range. 575 exactly, I think is a potentially cursed number for attack range for pro skew, where if you're a 575 range attack, like 80 carry, and especially I think if you have a reliable ranged slow, so that you can range leash people really easily, that's a really dangerous point to be at, because the sort of normal range for 80 carries is 550. And 575 means you have a meaningful advantage on them when auto trading and when just laning, and it also gives you a little bit of extra safety in a larger scale fight, right? And so I think it's one like there's a combination of several things here. The main thing is just that I think Varus's laning phase lacks counterplay, right? Especially if he's building lethality. But even the AS Varus, I think, has just a very, very consistent, reliable laning phase where you will get ahead in pro, because Varus, when played correctly, you outrange the standard 80 carries. Against the longer range 80 carries, you have your E to interact with them and to zone them and stuff, and all those things that you can do with the Varus E, which is basically a no gameplay slow and a bit of damage, right? It's very powerful. And what I'll talk about here is champions that have, like, so when people talk about pro skew champions, they often think about champions like Azir, right? Like, oh my God, Azir is so hard to master. Of course he would be pro skewed. The pros are going to be so good at Azir. That's sort of true, right? But actually, I think something that's even more pro skewed than being very, very hard to master, because there's lots of hard to master champions that aren't, don't see pro play, like Yasuo, for example. One of the things that's very pro skewed is having minimal to no counterplay in the moment, right? Because while Yasuo is very hard to play and very hard to master, he also has a lot of very situational counterplay that's hard to engage in, right? Part of the reason why Yasuo works in lower MMRs is even though the people there in bronze or iron or whatever are not that good at Yasuo, their opponents are also not accessing any of the complex Yasuo counterplay that exists. Conversely, you look at champions like, say, like a Vi or an Annie that have very low counterplay in the moment. They have very low strategic counterplay. And these champions are actually pro skewed, because it's not just in pro that your players are really good, and that's why Azir is good. It's that your opponents are also really good. And so if your champion doesn't offer them windows of opportunity to counterplay their spells, well, guess what? You get clicked on by Vyar, and you will be knocked up, right? That's gonna happen, right? One of the interesting stories here, to tangent stories, I don't think I've told this before in the Q&As, but one of the stories here is, for years internally at Riot, we're like, it's crazy that the pros don't play Vi. You can just click on someone and knock them up. It's so reliable. It's crazy they don't play her. And so August did some changes to her that made her feel a little better, right? It's particularly around some of the skill skewed mechanics on her, like Q Flash, which did work before, but they were just a little bit awkward to use. And then Zeri came into the meta. And the pros started saying, like, looking for, how can we lock down Zeri? Wait, this Vi champion does that. Maybe we need to pick Vi. And they started playing Vi, and she was very effective against Zeri. And then a weird thing happened. Zeri disappeared from the meta because she was nerfed, right? And you know what happened? Vi stayed, because the pros realized, yeah, this champion doesn't have counterplay, right? You just click R on them and they have to get knocked up. And there is some type of counterplay to it. But in the moment, there's no counterplay to getting knocked up by Vyar, right? The counterplay is have more allies nearby, don't be in that position, right? Like, et cetera, right? But sometimes you get trapped into situations where it's like, well, you walk into the range of the Vyar, or you don't, or you didn't know the Vi was there and she, queued over a wall and argued, or whatever, right? Like, but in the moment, there's no counterplay to Vyar. And so, same thing with Annie. And I think that's one of the things that Varus does really well, is that even though he's actually not a very hard champion to play, he lacks a lot of counterplay in his laning phase when piloted by a skilled player. And there's really nothing you could do except try to give up the minimum. And so I think that's the main aspect of him that's skewed towards pro play, is just his overwhelmingly powerful laning phase, where when piloted by a skilled player, because he has 575 attack range and a effectively no gameplay slow, he has so much laning phase agency to trade and win in the 2v2. That's what pros pick him for, right? And of course, lethality Varus is more pro skewed because he continues doing a lot of similar, like, low gameplay guaranteed wins later on in the game. Like, okay, we're going to stand posture around the dragon, we're going to wait for our Varus to hit a good Q, and then we're going to, pull the dragon, and they can't fight us because we hit a Q on one of their squishies, they can't win this 5v5 or whatever, right? But even AS Varus, I think, is pretty pro skewed as well, though less so than lethality, just because he doesn't do as many of those reliable things later on in the game. Anyway, as for non-bot lane, I think that one of the things that makes Varus more viable top lane than a lot of other 80 carries is the fact that he has a lot of target agnostic damage from Blight. Same thing with Vayne, where she has Silver Bolts. Those champions both have the ability to interact with very tanky targets favorably. And that's part of why like the version of Varus that was good top lane earlier this season was AP, right? Because that's the one where you scale your target agnostic damage the most, right? I think the versions of Varus that have been functional mid feel to me pretty similar to like Ezreal mid, where it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess this is kind of functional at times, just because, yeah, you're a caster and you go mid and you kind of do similar things to what like a mage would do there, but with slightly different properties because your auto attacks are better. I don't think the non-bot lane stuff is as clear cut as pro, where there's lots of AD carries that have fringe viability in solo lanes, or other non-bot roles, right? That's not unique to Varus. Just he comes up maybe a little bit more frequently because he's more target agnostic and a little bit better of a stat checker, and the stat checking part makes him good top as well. So I think that's my line of thinking around that. All right. Let's talk about barrier on ADCs. Feels mandatory. What about more diversity for ADCs? So, like I say in a lot of cases, especially when I talk about items, but I think this is true for summoner spells as well. I think it is far more important that your summoner spell feels good and appropriate for your champion, and it's something you're happy to use, than that you have diversity. If we can get diversity, that's great too, right? If you have different options that people can feel good about. But I would, if you offered me a choice of, in this system, the AD carry will have one summoner spell that they will feel good about, versus this system where they will have 3 summoner spells that they feel equally not great about. I would always take the one where they like the system where they have one option that feels good. And I think the complaint here to me, or I think the biggest issue with this, is that I don't think Barrier feels particularly great. In particular, I think that Barrier doesn't do a good job of telling you when you used it well. It's often unclear, was that the best time to use Barrier? Should I have used it half a second earlier, half a second later? Was I supposed to use it in this fight at all? It's often very unclear what a good use case is for Barrier. There are some that are very clear, like you Barrier a tower shot or whatever, right? Something like that can work, or you Barrier like a Veigar ult or something early in the game before it kills you through your barrier. But a lot of the barrier use cases are unclear whether you succeeded or failed at pressing barrier, and I don't love that. I think heal did have some upsides when we had that as the primary AD carry summoner. There was something cool about being able to interact with your teammates and your AD carry carrying a summoner that was like pro-social, like, oh, I can save my allies with this. I thought that was actually pretty cool because it gives a nice little extra dimension to the AD carry that it wouldn't normally have. Kind of for the same reason why I think it's actually really awesome that most tank supports are primary aftershock, is like, this is a selfish thing. Most of the things that they're trying to do are selfless. They're trying to move around the map, get their team ahead, build items like Locket that help their team, etc. Right? And so them having a selfish option that's their default choice, I think is actually good. Of like, oh, I take this thing and I get tankier. It's good for me personally. In the same way that I think heal was good for AD carries because it helped give you something selfless, whereas everything else you're doing as an AD carry is pretty selfish, right? I be able to do more damage for myself. And of course, that sort of indirectly helps your team because I do a lot of damage and I win team fights or whatever, right? But you're doing a lot of things for yourself. Having one thing that's not just for yourself, I thought was cool. But to me, the problem statement here, in my personal opinion, is more that barrier doesn't feel good as a summoner, more so than that it feels mandatory. And that would be my focus, is like, how can we make barrier feel better, or should we move to a summoner that feels better for ADCs? I think there are pretty significant game health risks around stuff like Ghost. Ghost I don't really like for AD carries because, I don't like it when it's the default choice. I think it's okay for it to be a fringe viable, like greedy option. But I think the scary thing about Ghost is when Ghost is the default choice for AD carries, that means both AD carries are usually going to take Ghost, and the end result of that is that the game is even more about AD carries, both because Ghost is very snowbally, right? It means that you can kite backwards and forwards much more effectively in 5v5s and skirmishes, and also because you're lacking combat summoners, the bot lane will actually snowball harder, right? You're taking a mobility summoner over a combat summoner, but it's a mobility summoner that's a lot better at going forwards than backwards, right? Ultimately, the way that I look at this is, can we make barrier feel better or replace it with something that does feel good for AD carries? I think that would be great. If we could get extra summoners that could be viable for AD carries, that would be good too, right? But it wouldn't be my priority in this space particularly, is what I would look at here. So that's my thoughts on that. Has there ever been any serious discussion about doing significant changes based on different servers in terms of gameplay? The short answer is no. I can talk about some of the non-gameplay stuff. Like, as an example, I think this was season 9. NA and one other region that I don't remember actually tested roll queue, right? And that does sort of indirectly affect gameplay, I guess. It's kind of a meta systems thing, but it's not literally gameplay. And I think in general, we want League of Legends to be League of Legends, no matter whether you're a Chinese player or a Brazilian player or a Dutch player or whatever, right? No matter who you are, no matter where you are, the game you're playing is League of Legends. There isn't Chinese League of Legends and American League of Legends. I mean, there kind of is in that the players in those regions play differently and they play different picks, right? But the reason why the game is different is because the players are different, not because the champions are different, right? It's okay if Yasuo looks kind of bad in NA because people in NA don't play that much Yasuo. And because ultimately you could put 300 games into Yasuo and get just as good as those Chinese players who are playing Yasuo and being really effective. Yasuo is good. It's just you have to put in the time, right? And they don't actually have to put in 300 games. That's an exaggeration, but you get the idea. Here is that the game is the game. Balance is balance, right? And at the end of the day, some things might be more frustrating in some regions than others if they're, you just have a lot of players of this, this champion or whatever. And we may need to do some things for one region, but we generally want the game to be the game and we want the experience to be the same, no matter where you are, no matter who you are. The actual core game experience is the same, and the differences in servers come from the players. That's our philosophy approaching this, I think, and so that's why there's never been any serious discussion about having different gameplay. For what it's worth, I think that honestly, maybe the biggest trade-off here would be potential competitive integrity, right? Like, what does it even mean to have different, like Korean changes or whatever, right? Like, what does that even mean for competitive? Like, what about when you go to Worlds? Which version do you play on at Worlds? Like, does that even make sense? That's kind of mystifying to me, like how you would approach that. And that's why I think, to my knowledge, I don't think any competitive games have actually ever done different gameplay in different regions. There's a lot of non-competitive games that do it, right? Path of Exile, for example, has actually different core gameplay in the Chinese version. And if I were working on Path of Exile, I probably wouldn't love that. I definitely wouldn't love that if I were working on Path of Exile. But I think for a non-competitive game, it's a little bit easier to get away with that kind of stuff. Like, oh, this is better for the players of this region. But there's not like a competitive disadvantage or advantage to being a, I don't know, Frostbolt player in Chinese PoE in Chinese PoE compared to, international PoE, right? Whereas imagine a world where Yasuo is stronger in NA, how upset would you be seeing that? Or like, how is that fair to Yasuo players in China, right? So that's my thought on that. What is the plan for Tryndamere? Any initial thoughts? Talking about build, big crits, what should he do? What would we do if he reworked? So I'll mention a couple of things here. One is that Tryndamere is a very popular champion for people to spin up on their own time, like mid-scopes for. I've seen, I don't know, 3 or maybe 4 different mid-scopes over the years that people tried for Tryndamere that we just ended up scrapping because we didn't think they were good enough, or we didn't think they met the needs of the Tryndamere audience. The critical thing that I'll bring up here is that Tryndamere works for the people that play him right now. There's not a thing that they like that the Tryndamere players are super mad about or super upset about their champion kit. There's not like some, thing that's driving Tryndamere players to stop playing the champion and like driving them away, unless something has happened very recently, right? I'm not super up to date with the most recent data, but like over the years, right? It's not like we're sitting here in a position where it's like, oh my God, we got to do something about Tryndamere. The player base is bleeding. They're not playing him. It's like he's maintained a stable player base for many years. The people who play him really like him. And so anything that we do, we need to respect those players, right? And we need to respect that they have a thing that they like doing, which is spinning on people and getting big crits and not dying. And in fact, if I were to go into work on Monday and someone, my producer comes up to me and says, drop all the work that you're doing right now, you are going to midscope Tryndamere, and it needs to be the best Tryndamere midscope that we've ever seen. Because again, we've seen a number of these internally that have been scrapped over the years. The place where I would start personally, from my perspective, is I would say, okay, how can I make a new queue to give him a new interesting laning pattern that is not about building and spending Fury to heal only, right? Because that just, I think it's really, really, the queue gameplay is really, really binary and often feels bad for both the players on both sides of, okay, the Tryndamere's ahead, he doesn't need to press Q to heal. Okay, well, he gets to stay at full combat power all the time and just threaten to fight you. Oh, you're really behind his Tryndamere? Well, guess what? You never get to build up your combat power, so you can never actually fight them because you have to keep spamming Q to heal because you're getting harassed, right? So replacing the Q, that would be my first step. And then I'd probably look for other ways of doing the W, right? The W is a target access / sticking power tool. And I would want to look at ways of giving him those things in another form that would be more interesting, more fun for the Tryndamere player, and potentially have a little bit better variance in the game, where I don't think that the variance on Tryndamere W, either the current version or the previous version, is particularly great around, you know, how Tryndamere plays around the spell and all that, and how his opponents can play around the spell. And so those would be the spells I would be looking at. Like, I would start by leaving the, you know, E, R, and passive pretty much identical. And it'd be, part of that is that I think Tryndamere, like, some people would say, oh, but what about the RNG crits in the early laning phase? Yeah, Tryndamere's the RNG crit guy in the early laning phase. Is that good? Is it bad? It's like, I don't think it's good, but I don't think it's the worst thing ever either, right? If there was a better way we could get him a lot of early laning phase variants that Tryndamere players felt equally good about, sure, that would be better. But I think part of why people play Tryndamere is because there is that variance. They can sometimes just crit someone and have a like really spiky, sharp experience of, oh man, my auto attack just did bonus damage, and now I get to, you know, play differently because of that. Okay, right? Is it the best gameplay ever? No. But is it so bad that we can't have it in the game? I also think no. I think it's fine, right? Lots of things, you know, don't have amazing gameplay, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the worst thing ever and they have to be changed. So that's kind of a summary of my thought. I like, if I were doing changes to Tryndamere, my take would be like, he needs to do big crits. He needs to not be able to die. He needs to be able to, you know, spin on people. Those are like the core aspects of Tryndamere to me, as someone who's played some but not a ton of Tryndamere. And I would, of course, probably, like, if I were actually doing work on Tryndamere, I'd probably go talk to a bunch of Tryndamere players like I did with Kled and be like, okay, what's the core of this champion to you? And I try to preserve those things for them and make that work. That'd be my approach, I think, is going towards that. Okay, buff Lux's W rank up incentive to reward ranking W second. So this is a really funny one. I remember, this point it was weeks ago, but I remember when I put this in the document, I remember exactly, I knew exactly what I was going to say. We tried this before. There was a version of Lux where the W rank up was quite powerful. And do you want to know what the result of that was? Was that if you max W as support, you were 58% or 59% win rate, depending on the patch. And do you want to know what percentage of players did it? Less than 20%. Even when it was in the game for months, right? And it was like a well-established thing that people were literally playing in pro. I remember watching Core JJ play a game of W max support Lux in the LCS. Even when this was literally in pro, this is not what Lux support players want. And they don't actually want to put points in W, right? Now, specifically the question is about maxing W second. And so maybe there is a fine point of balance where we can make it better to max W second for like mid Lux or support Lux. But ultimately, what we've concluded is that the Lux players, for the most part, want to do damage. They want to max E first, for sure. And they probably want to max Q second, right? Like, they probably want to do more damage. That's what they're there for, right? They're not there to play around the W. The W is a sort of tertiary aspect of the kit for most Lux players. Now, it's not to say there isn't an audience for this, right? I want to be clear. I do think there is an audience for some like Lux players that do care about the supportive aspect of Lux, which is the W. But that is just such a small percentage of our audience, very clearly, because when you talk about something that's like, well, this is like literally 8% better or more than something like than in terms of just max order comparatively to something else, and very few people are doing it, that kind of power would pull in a lot of people, right? And so I think it's pretty clear that the bulk of the Lux audience wouldn't want this, or wouldn't want power to be in W second or W first, especially, right? That to me is like pretty clear. Is that this is just not something that the bulk of Lux players would actually want, even though I'm sure there is an audience for it. And so I don't think that we could actually do this to Lux. I think if we wanted this, we would, like this kind of gameplay, we would make another champion, and maybe we'd call her Seraphine, right? Okay, that's sort of a oblique, maybe terrible joke there, but that's part of the idea of some of these other sort of between the mage and enchanter space champions, right? Karma and Seraphine are, I think, the best examples, where we have different levels of how much of your kit is enchanter versus how much of your kit is mage. And Lux is the one where she's like almost all mage, and that, like, her player base absolutely showcases that, right? Like, in that they don't care that much about the supportive aspects of the kit, and that's fine, right? Whereas there's a lot of Karma players out there that just build full Enchanter every game. She's like maybe 50-50, right? Between Mage and Enchanter, and a lot of her player base is more on the Enchanter side. So that's my thoughts on this, I would say. Okay. AD Mejai's one. This will be the last question before I close out the video. So this is talking about like Sword of the Occult. So I would say this is something that I would say we kind of already have, right? Hubris is supposed to be this. Hubris is supposed to be the aggressive snowballing item. And I don't think it does this super well. I will say we are planning on buffing it by 200 gold cost so that it's a little more attractive to people. But Hubris is supposed to do this in a less sharp way than Sword of the Occult. Now, the original justification for the removal of Sword of the Occult, which I don't necessarily know if everyone agrees with today on League gameplay design, was that the reason why Mejai's was okay and Sword of the Occult wasn't okay is that AD scales your auto attacks, right? And so when Rengar buys Sword of the Occult, there's really nothing that you can do to avoid him clicking on you and killing you instantly, right? Because it's just so much AD. Whereas when Lux buys Mejai's, you can still dodge her spells, right? Like, and you could kill her still, right? And so a lot of her counterplay ends up being very similar. Whereas because AD scales the auto attack ratio and that doesn't have counterplay, Mejai's has a sort of an extra dimension, a extra dimension of counterplay to it. Now, you might point out the most common users of Mejai's actually don't have that counterplay, right? This is like Evelyn, for example, where it's like, yeah, if Evelyn shows up on you and she's hitting you, you're probably dead, right? Kind of similar to how Rengar clicks on you, Evelyn clicks on you. There's at least some different counterplay to Evelyn, but we don't need to get into the weeds on that. Again, I don't necessarily know if everyone on League gameplay design would agree with that these days, but I do think that the goal of Hubris was to be kind of a modern take on Sword of the Occult, and I think at an appropriate power level, maybe it can do that really well. Maybe it feels like that kind of Sword of the Occult-y vibe. But I'm not sure, right? I would say let's keep an eye on it after we buff it by 200 gold and kind of see what happens. Because if it doesn't do his job, it's like that job as like being this turbo snowball item when it's relatively a lot cheaper. Like it's 200 gold is a huge buff. Then maybe we need to reconsider what the like AD snowball-y item should look like. And maybe that should be Hubris, or maybe Hubris shouldn't be in the game, or maybe Hubris should do something else, right? So that's kind of my thought on this. Anyway, thanks for watching. And that's Discord Q&A number 12. Catch you next time.